Along the lines of working with emotional closeness and the avoidance or resistance against emotional closeness, it's important to look at the class of patients that avoid emotional closeness because they only see two choices. That's the expression of the interpersonal component of the resistance. It's simply not possible to think of resistances and defense mechanisms as somehow being devoid of the distancing function. Okay, that could be distancing through distortion via splitting and projection in the fragile spectrum. That could be distancing through repression, instant repression, self-attack, or that could be distancing through isolating affect, reenacting an old pathological relationship. But no matter how you splice it and dice it, resistances and defenses have an interpersonal component to them, that by nature one of the functions is to distance from the object or the therapist that is eliciting, evoking, stimulating the avoided psychic material, feelings and impulses. Hi everyone, I'm going to continue the theme of emotional distancing. Emotional distancing cuts to the heart of what we do and what we're concerned about as ISTDP or ISTDP-informed psychotherapists. Even the avoidance or the resisting of the internal experience of feelings and impulses involves by necessity also keeping the therapist at a distance. That's why you'll see patients look away from you as the feelings begins to mobilize, because the therapist has a big role in those feelings getting mobilized, right? By virtue of inviting an intimate attachment, a real relationship. So just understand that the idea of talking about defenses or resistance in some sort of context where the resistance or the defenses could somehow be devoid of an interpersonal component involving distancing from the therapist, either through distortions via splitting and projection, or through just detaching and isolating affect, or turning anger inward, self-attack, repression, instant repression, right? Whether it's through any of those means, you cannot have avoidance of internal feeling and impulse without also, by necessity, distancing from you, the therapist. It just doesn't make sense. You can have a collaborative patient that's very open with you and shares relevant information, but when push comes to shove and you approach the central conflicts and the patient begins to internally try to fight off their feelings and impulses that begin to get mobilized and emerge, then you will also have that patient begin to distance from you, the therapist. So there's always an interpersonal component to the defenses. Along the lines of working with emotional closeness and the avoidance or resistance against emotional closeness, it's important to look at the class of patients that avoid emotional closeness because they only see two choices. They've had experiences that have led them to associate letting someone close to them, allowing someone to become important to them, being seen by the other. They've come to associate that experience with loss of autonomy and having to be an extension of the other person. And so for this class of patients, they have, in their mind, there's two options. One is to allow the other person close to them, but then to give up their sense of autonomy and feel like they need to be an extension of the other person and their agenda. And what could be worse, right, than giving up your autonomy? Very few things are worse than that, okay? The other option they see that in order to preserve a sense of autonomy and independence, they need to keep the other at an arm's length distance. So for this class of patients, it's very important that we let them know that based on the two options that they see, that they perceive, the healthier one is to do what they're doing. If those are the only two options your patient can see, then it makes sense that they would opt for keeping you at an arm's length distance. Because again, what could be worse than giving up your autonomy? Okay, so you have major loneliness when you go down that path, right, as a human being. But if it means keeping a sense of autonomy, most people are going to do that. So you want to convey to the patient that operates within this framework that you can see why they would want to keep you at a distance if they're thinking that letting you close involves you, the therapist, becoming the boss of them, essentially. Okay? That they lose their autonomy. And but then you want to say, but what if there's a third alternative where you could let me close but not give up an iota of your autonomy? And most clients will go, wow, that would be amazing. Okay? And I'm referring to the clients that fit into this class. At that point, you have to nimbly facilitate an experience where at a low level, the patient can at least cognitively become aware of and acknowledge mixed feelings towards you. Sometimes it's as easy as just asking them if they're aware that there's some mixed feelings here, just by virtue of how risky it feels to engage in the psychotherapeutic endeavor. And oftentimes, it's sort of low-hanging fruit. The patient can readily say, yeah, I do have some mixed feelings. At which point, you can say, as you acknowledge having mixed feelings here with me, did it feel like you lost your autonomy? Did I become the boss of you? Or do you still feel in charge and in control over yourself? 9 out of 10 times, the patient here will say, no, I still feel in charge of myself. It's fine. At which point you want to help them see that what they just did was an act of emotional intimacy. They allowed you close. They allowed you to see that they feel both positive and negative towards you. So you say, so this is intimacy. Maybe this is your ticket to freedom. Because here, you allowed me close, and yet you didn't give up an inch of your autonomy. And often the patient here will feel a relief from a sense of being alone, a relief from a sense of loneliness. So here then we drive home insight that they no longer have to make this dreadful choice between keeping a sense of autonomy, but basically then being alone in the universe, versus letting people close, but then giving up your autonomy and basically being a lapdog, yeah? And so this is a major, major deal because you're facilitating an experience where the experience of closeness is experientially reframed, right? So you're beginning to turn away from the old model of closeness, which involved loss of autonomy, and help them see with you in the transference that they can have emotional closeness that does not involve giving up an iota of their autonomy, okay? So once you've facilitated that sort of corrective emotional experience pertaining to autonomy and closeness, okay, then now you have a platform, a foundation from which you can have a collaborator where you and the patient are pulling in the same direction. In other words, as long as the patient associates allowing you or anybody else close with loss of autonomy, they rightly resist that. They rightly avoid that. Like, that's a healthy thing to do, and you want to underscore that. You want to say, if those are the only two options you see, it's healthier to keep a distance. As lonely as it might be, as I'm sure it is, that's the healthier alternative, right? But as you facilitate this experience that I just outlined, now you have an opportunity to really work with a collaborator where they can allow you close and still have all these complex mixed feelings, but it won't be the sense that their autonomy is at stake. So when it comes to working with resistance against emotional closeness, the real relationship, genuine emotional contact, there are these sets of clients and patients that have had very painful life experiences where the only way to be close involves foregoing the self, putting the self on the back burner, giving up your autonomy just to be an extension of the other. So with these clients, which by the way, they exist across the psychoneurotic spectrum and the fragile spectrum, although it's more common with lower ego adaptive capacity, but you could have all clients across the spectrum can fit into this category. So this is one more example of how things can go really wrong if you simply just hammer on feelings right out of the gate as soon as you see signs of some sort of tension or anxiety. There are many, many reasons why that can go wrong. I mean, if that approach works for you, all the power to you. But there are many, many reasons why that can go haywire and often spells misalliances. But one of them is just for this reason. Typically, you want to establish yourself in the patient's life as someone that they would want to open up to. A good way to do that is to get to know them a little bit. Okay, and secondly, what I'm just talking about, facilitating a corrective emotional experience around autonomy and closeness. I hope this little chat about closeness and autonomy and how to deal with this very thorny, important issue that affects a whole range, a whole class of patients, I hope that it was useful to you, and take good care. Till next time.